So today we have a 3-part meeting ahead of us, and we'll have a public talk. After that, we'll have a Bible study by means of the Watchtower. And at last, we'll have a special talk that's prepared for us today. So we have a visiting speaker, Brother Yeomans, going to deliver the public discourse entitled, "Is God Still in Control?"
So our question this morning is, God still in control? And when we think about that question, really it's out of appreciation for the effort everyone makes to come along to our meetings, as has been mentioned by our chairman, and we've expressed that in prayer. Whether we've been coming along to gatherings of God's people for a long time or maybe a short time, even the first time, we've made a decision and an effort to be here this morning, to consider God's words. And the relevance then of our question is meaningful for us. When we think about learning about God and following his direction, well, it really makes a difference. Is God still in control? If God is not still in control, well then does following his guidance make sense? Will it bring any lasting benefits, not only for us, but for our worship and our relationship with him? And so this morning, that's why we want to look at this question, because we live in a world that seems out of control. And we encounter many difficulties and anxieties in life because of the system we live in. So we want to reassure ourselves, is God still in control? And to answer that question, we've got a couple of questions that lead up to it. If God is still in control, well, how does God exercise control? Does he have the right to exercise control? And if he does, well, we see many reject the idea of following guidance from God. Well, how is it that God's right has been challenged? And what can we do in the meantime? And what can we look forward to in the future if God is in control? So there's some of the questions that we want to look at this morning. So let's consider the first of them, and we'll need our Bibles for this. Where would we go to for this, to try to find an answer to this question? Why should God be in control? Would you think of a scripture that comes to your mind? Well, maybe a few. Let's go to the very first scripture. The first book of the Bible, Genesis. We'll go to chapter 1 and we'll go to verse 1, right at the start. So if we turn that up, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and let's see if that helps us with this question. Why should God be in control? So do we have the verse there? It says, and we may have read this before, but let's have a look. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So from nothing, the Bible says God brought everything into existence. And that's different from something that we might do. If we construct something, if we make something, or if we bake something, well, we use construction materials, don't we? Or we use ingredients that already exist, and we transform them a little bit into something that's more suitable, more edible. But here was God bringing everything into existence from nothing. And just from a scientific point of view, not that I'm an expert by any means in the science, but we've probably read the scientific material, and scientists understand that there's a connection between energy and matter, and so that by means of energy can be transformed into matter and vice versa, and from that it's generally understood that that's how the universe had its start. What sort of control was being exercised there right at the start? Well, here's a little quote from a magazine, Scientific American, and it was reflecting on this thought that matter, which is things, substance, is simply one form of energy. A little mass harbours unbelievable energy, it says. But it says right at the start there, the forces involved were very finely balanced when the universe came into existence. You might know that scientists sometimes call that the Big Bang, when the universe came into existence. And so it uses that phrase. It says if the Big Bang had slightly less energy, the expansion of the universe would have been less rapid, and it would have collapsed back in on itself. So we can think of the forces and gravities involved there if it had slightly less energy. But what if it had slightly more energy? Well, it says if the explosion had slightly more energy, the universe might have dispersed too thin to clump together into stars. And so that's why it says, well, right at the outset there, things were very finely balanced under very fine control. And so it uses two words there, or uses it twice, slightly more or slightly less. What does it mean by slightly? How fine-tuned was it? Well, it says that the ratio of matter and energy to the volume of space at the Big Bang must have been within about 1/1,000,000,000th of 1% of ideal. Would you say that's very fine control? Well, we appreciate that, don't we? And that's just one example where we see God exercising very fine control. So that's one reason. Why God should be in control? Well, he just brought it into it. It's just a matter of justice. He made it exist, but he did so in such a fine way. Here's a second reason. Can you think of a second reason why God should be in control? Well, let's have a look at the last verse of chapter 1. Would you agree with this statement? Because when we read through Genesis 1, you remember, the creative days, and God looked at things he made, and he said, well, this was good, made something else, this was good, made something else, this was good, and finally humans was good. But what do we read there in verse 31? It says there, after that, God saw everything he had made, and look, it was very good. Well, would we agree? Well, we sure would, wouldn't we? What God has made, what's the difference between good and very good, would you say? Well, that reminds us, doesn't it? Jehovah has standards. And he realised that what had been brought into existence met his highest standard of excellence. Something is very good. It is self-evidently good. And wouldn't we agree? So there's two reasons why we would say, yes, God should be in control. Well, that raises a question then. If God should be in control, how does he exercise control? And that's a good question for us to think about, because wouldn't we agree in the world we live in, when we see control exercised, would we say it's always done in a nice way, in a way that's beneficial to others? Sometimes when we think of coming under the control of someone else, whether it's a government or other people dominated, well, it hasn't led to beneficial outcomes, has it? And people sometimes in fear of the control that is exercised by others. And particularly if we're just starting to learn about God and wondering whether this is the path, well, that can be something that we might understandably be anxious about, the way God exercises control. So let's have a think about how God exercises control. Can we think against some scriptures? Where could we go to find out how God exercises control? You think of one. Maybe if we just come back a few verses to still in chapter 1, verse 26, say. And so chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. It says there, this is the point about making humans. God said, let us make man in our image. Now, what does that mean? Well, when it says man, it wasn't being gender specific. It's talking about humans, wasn't it? And it says there it's going to make humans in our image according to our likeness. Now, does that mean that as humans we look like God? Well, we would understand that's not the case, wouldn't we? The Bible is a spiritual book, but it's saying that we reflect God, his spiritual qualities, and God has made us that way. And we see why. It says, according to our likeness, let them, humans, have in subjection the fish of the sea, the flying creatures of the heavens, the domestic animals, and all the earth, and every creeping animal that is moving on the earth. So there's a beautiful role for humans, and what a beautiful privilege they have to have in subjection, which we could think about in a positive way. It means caring for something, managing it, being a guardian of the fish and the domestic animals, the pets, looking after them. And what is it that helps manage that, exercise that control over the animals? And it says there, all the earth, the environment. Well, it needs management, doesn't need care. What is it that's going to keep everything nice and orderly and well looked after? Well, humans were made in God's image, and we think about reflecting God's qualities. What are some qualities of God that come to mind? Well, we might think of love is one, isn't it? So God has put into humans a capacity to love. For example, the animals, the birds, the environment. Isn't that true? We do, aren't we? We love those things. And because of that, well, that means that we're going to care for them well. Just to give you an example of that, the subject there, looking after the environment, little textbook here on horticulture had something to say about looking after gardens, and we may have some experience of this because we go witnessing, don't we? Many of us go from door to door, and if you were going witnessing, you come across someone there, and you see haven't even met them yet, but they've got a nice garden. Now, what would you say about that person in that home? They've cared for their garden. What would you say about them? Would you say, well, here's someone who's obviously gone to university and has studied all the facts and figures about plants, and they've got all the scientific knowledge, and they've applied all that to produce that beautiful garden? Well, we probably wouldn't, would we? We'd probably agree with this statement in this horticultural textbook. It said here, no special qualifications are needed to become a gardener, just an interest in plants. That's more the point, isn't it? Someone loves plants. That's what we'd say, isn't it? That's why they have a lovely garden. They love those things. And it's the same, isn't it? We care for our pets, not because we know all the scientific, biological facts about them necessarily, but we love pets and we care for them. And how does Jehovah exercise that control? Well, one reason there is love. And the Insight book had this to say, Jehovah glories in the fact that his sovereignty and the support of it by his creatures is based primarily on love. So when we think about the way God exercises control, doesn't that help us draw close to him when we reflect on the way that he exercises control? Primarily on love. Now, if it's primarily on love, does that mean, well, that's all there is to it? It's God doesn't need any rules and regulations, and would we say that? Well, we'd probably realise, well, no, God does have some rules. Can you think of an example of where God has a rule? Well, let's take out our Bible, find one. Just go to the next chapter of the Bible. And this is a rule. It's no longer specifically applicable. in its exact sense, but it's an example. Genesis chapter 2, let's have a look down there in verse 16. It says there, Jehovah God also gave this command to the man. So yes, God has rules, and here's one, a command. It said, and we might know this rule, from every tree of the garden you may eat, to satisfaction. But as for the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat from it. For in the day you eat from it, you will certainly die. So here's an example of a rule, isn't it? And God gave this to the first humans, and it was very specific, and they understood that quite well. Why did God have that rule, do you think? Now, some have looked at that rule and come to the conclusion, well, here's an example of God being arbitrary, that is, just making rules for the sake of them and no real benefit. Now, we're not under this rule anymore, but it's an example, isn't it? For us to draw close to God, one way is to really appreciate that when he does have rules and gives us guidance and direction, he does so out of love for us, for our benefit. It makes it easier for us to apply it, but also has helped us grow to love God because we see that he just wants the best for us. But what about in this situation? Is this an example? Would we say, how was this beneficial to Adam and Eve, this rule? Can we think of some ways God was thinking about their benefit? Well, we see there God was really looking at Adam and Eve, and he said there, well, look, he'd given them every tree of the garden that they could eat from. But what would have been the consequence of that? And maybe our parents would understand this. When we have children, we want them to grow up well, don't we? We want them to have good qualities and be able to interact well with others, to be able to contribute positively to the community. When we think about the qualities we see and want to inculcate into our children and enjoy them developing, what's something that we wouldn't want our children to be? Can you think of some things that we wouldn't want in our children? Well, maybe here's one. Would you want your children to be spoiled? What's a spoiled child? Well, definitions might vary. But maybe we could express it like this. A spoiled child is a child that never hears mum or dad say no. Child gets everything they want, they get used to that, and what happens is sometimes they feel like they've missed out on something. Instead of just accepting that gracefully, what happens? Well, maybe we've seen it in a shop or when we've gone out somewhere. Maybe the child acts up, throws a tantrum, and then mum and dad give in and the child gets its way. And we realise, don't we, well, that's probably not beneficial for that child long run in terms of the qualities that they would be cultivating. And we see that, don't we, in verse 16. Jehovah has said he's given them everything, but as a responsible parent, for their benefit, he's just made sure, well, they're not going to be spoiled, but give them just that sense, well, here's a time when God says no. And from their benefit, from their point of view, they would understand, well, here's our opportunity to show our respect and our appreciation to our Creator. Given us everything, and, well, there's a special tree there. We'll leave that reserved, and what a privilege we have to be able to demonstrate our thanks to God by treating that as special. You know, as we study the Bible, maybe for our newer ones, we might come across a little expression about God's rule back there. It didn't imply anything bad about Adam and Eve. So God wasn't giving them a rule because he thought they were naughty or bad. It didn't imply anything bad. What do we mean by that? A rule that doesn't imply anything bad. Well, we read there previously, Jehovah wanted Adam and Eve and the humans to care for the whole earth and include the domestic animals, So here's a rule that might have implied something bad. Well, God looked, well, we need the animals to be cared for, the pets. Here's my rule, Adam and Eve, don't be cruel to kittens. Well, we could say, that's something we don't want Adam and Eve to do. But what would that imply about them? What that would imply about you if someone came along and said that to you, what are you saying? What are you implying about? I wouldn't even think of kittens, and we love them. So God wasn't implying anything bad. He loved Adam and Eve, wanted something for their benefit. Now, we're not under this rule, but it just gives us a sense when we do come across rules, and as we study and we learn, all of us are learning and coming across situations in our life where different rules apply that may not have applied before. God gives us guidance, reflecting that it is for our benefit. God exercises control in a beneficial way. Well, we've mentioned, haven't we, God's right to rule was challenged, and we see that just everywhere we look on the world today. God's right to rule was challenged. How did that happen? Just briefly, where would we go for that? Well, we know, don't we, if we've studied a little bit, we've probably come across it there in chapter 3. God's right to rule was challenged. Which verses? Well, there's a few there. The early verses is talking about the serpent, and we know that was really Satan, the devil, using the serpent like a ventriloquist would use it. And Satan, as we know, is a resistor, an enemy, an adversary. The devil is an opposer, and he was revealing himself there in what he said. You notice there, he asks the woman what the rule was. Did God really give this rule? And the woman responded, here's the rule. She knew what it was. But then in verse 4, at this the serpent said to the woman, you certainly will not die if you disobey that rule. So was that a challenge to God's sovereignty? Well, yes. And when we've done our studies, what was Satan implying there when he said, you certainly will not die? Well, we can see there it's contradiction of God. He's contradicting what God had said. So he's basically saying, well, God is a liar. What God has told you was not true, you will not die. So saying God is a liar. And then in verse 5, he adds to it and says, for God knows. So basically saying there, God was deliberately doing this. God was misrepresenting, knowingly misrepresenting it. God knows, this is what Satan was saying, God knows that in the very day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you'll be like God, knowing good and bad. And so in addition to saying God was a liar, what else is he saying? Well, he's saying actually you'd be better off if you disobey what God says. God is withholding something beneficial from you, withholding something good from you. So there was a challenge to God's sovereignty. Well, and Adam and Eve took that decision, didn't they? They went off and said, okay, well, we will go our way and see what the results are, and we're seeing those results. And the results have been distressing, wouldn't we say? And that can be a real challenge for us as we learn about God, starting to learn, maybe trying to draw close to God, because we live in a world that is out of control and people are suffering. And there's a sense there, well, why, if God has this power, if he can exercise control, why hasn't he stepped in and stopped these bad things happening? And we can understand why people might feel that way. But what would happen if he did? If God did step in and put an end to bad things happening. For example, at the moment, what are we seeing? We're seeing dreadful things happening in warfare, heart-rending suffering. And people say, why doesn't God stop those bad consequences of war? Well, that's a fair question, but what would happen if he did? Well, imagine if those consequences there were stopped, what would that effectively be saying? Well, of course, wars don't just happen, do they? They don't just happen out of nowhere. Things lead up to it. What leads up to war? Well, isn't it human greed, selfishness, nationalism, a love of violence, false religion? All these things contribute to war. If God just put an end to the bad consequences of war, what it would be saying? Well, it would be saying, well, you can have all these bad qualities, exhibit those in your life, and you won't have any bad consequences. And he would be proving something that is very damaging to us, something that contradicts everything we know is right, because we know those qualities that people display do lead to bad consequences, and we see that. So God hasn't stepped in to prevent all the bad consequences of human decisions. But does that mean that God hasn't exercised any sovereignty at all since Adam and Eve made their decision? Well, let's have a look at some scriptures that just show to us that he has. Psalm 89, for instance. And let's just have a look down there in verse 35 and 36. He said this to David, I have sworn in my holiness once and for all, I will not tell lies to David. His offspring will endure forever. His throne will endure like the sun before me. So we know King David was part of that line, and his line of descent, as it says there, will endure forever. His line of descent would culminate in the Messiah. And down through history, what did God do to make sure that that promise came true? Well, it wasn't easy to keep that promise, was it? Because Satan was trying to do everything he possibly could to prevent that promise coming true. But Jehovah made sure he protected Jerusalem. He protected the temple arrangement. He protected the village of Bethlehem, the records of the line of descent, the genealogy, preserved the Bible, did everything to make sure that he didn't tell lies to David. And we see how that worked out, don't we? Because we know how it worked out. When Jesus was born, Joseph and Mary, where were they? Well, we know they lived in Nazareth, but was that where Jesus was born? No, he was born in Bethlehem. Why was Jesus born in Bethlehem? Well, because they had to go back there for the census, didn't they? Because that's where their family originated. Why did their family originate in Bethlehem? Well, because that's where David was from. So we know Jehovah did not tell lies to David, and it all came true, and Jehovah made sure of that. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, let's have a look at Luke chapter 24, because we're going to see here a time when people thought things weren't really in control in the way that they expected. Luke 24, this is an account really just after Jesus had been put to death. So here was the Messiah finally arrived, and now he's been put to death. How would you feel? Well, maybe not knowing everything we do now, we might have felt the way some people felt back there. There were some people there, very disconsolate, walking along the road, and we see that start there in verse 13. Two of them travelling to a village, and they were conversing with each other. Sorry, just skipping through this a bit. Conversing, discussing these things. They didn't realise Jesus had been resurrected, and Jesus sidles up beside them, and they didn't know, didn't recognise him. But they were disconsolate. So in 17, Jesus asked them, well, what are these things you're talking about, debating amongst yourselves? And in answer, verse 18, the one named Cleopas said to him, are you a stranger dwelling alone in Jerusalem? Do not know the things that have occurred there during these days? He asked them, well, what things? They said, the things concerning Jesus, who proved to be a prophet, powerful in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death and they nailed him to the stake. But we were hoping that this man was the one who was going to deliver Israel. Well, we can understand their thoughts, can't we? Things seemed to have not gone according to God's promise. Things weren't in control. Their hopes had not been realised. How did Jesus answer them? Well, let's have a look down there in verse 25. Jesus says to them, "O senseless ones." He wasn't being disparaging, but he was just saying, well, you didn't quite get the sense of it. Verse 25 there, he says, "Slow of heart to believe all the things the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?" Starting with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them things pertaining to himself in the Scriptures. Well, what has Jesus just said there? Well, don't we believe all the things the prophets have spoken? Well, what prophets? Well, the prophets in God's Word, the Bible. Prophets, history in advance, promises that God had made. He had promised that the Messiah would come to earth, and he had promised that the Messiah would be put to death. He knew that that would happen and made that promise. So is God a liar? Well, even if it costs him the life of his only begotten, dearest Son, God is not a liar. What else did Jesus say? Well, why did Jesus have to die? Well, was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things? Well, why was it necessary? Was it necessary for God? Was it necessary for Jesus? It was necessary for us. It's our original parents that had disobeyed God, come under the sentence of death, didn't have life, everlasting life to pass on. Here we are suffering. And God has understood necessary for us to give his only begotten Son. So would God ever withhold anything good from you and me? Well, even if it costs him the life of his only begotten Son, he will never withhold anything good from us. And that's why we love God, isn't it? And that's why when we think about decisions in our life, our obedience to God, our study of God's Word, our following his direction, well, we do those things out of love for God, out of respect for his sovereignty. And if we're just learning about God and maybe thinking, what do I do with my life? Should I dedicate my life to God? Should I promise that I will follow his direction? Well, we would warmly encourage you to do just that. Because God is in control, but he exercises control for our benefit. He's put in us the capacity to love because he is the God of love. And out of love, God is still in control.